The van rolled into town before sunrise. Doors open, engine cold, but the two kids who drove it into Alaska's wild never came back. What really happened that night on the ridge? For 30 years, the Johnson River whispered the same story. Two kids vanished without a trace. Then a hunter stumbled on something that shouldn't have survived the thaw. Half buried in spring mud, a child's glove told investigators they'd been looking in the wrong place all along. But the real twist was who it led them to. Tap subscribe and join us as we uncover the chilling truth behind the vanishing at Dry Creek. It was early May 1985, and the lingering dusk of the Alaskan spring barely settled into night when the call came in to the small local detachment of the Alaska State Troopers in the remote village of Dry Creek. Some 50 miles north of Anchorage, a hunter had found something odd on a ridge overlooking the wooded bank of the frozen Johnson River. The tail fin of a late 70s Ford van, its paint faded, half buried in spring snowmelt and brush, its doors ajar. The engine was cold. The interior was intact, but one of the seats had been pulled forward, and beneath the seat lay an item that snapped the case open. A red-brown leather backpack with a child's stuffed bear attached. A woman's glove, the size of a teenage hand, lay puddled in the thaw water near the driver's side. There was no body. Trooper Helen Rivers was first on scene. She remembers the soft but persistent sound of dripping water, the smell of must from the melting snow, and the hush of the Alaskan evening. The ridge was quiet. The van, registration marked 1981, was licensed to a small Anchorage address, but the name had been scratched from the plate. The glove bore no obvious prints. The backpack had a name tag, but the ink had run in the melt. The investigation that followed would stretch for decades, spanning hundreds of miles of wilderness, broken witness accounts, and dead ends. It would come to be known as the vanishing at Dry Creek. The missing vehicle belonged to 14-year-old Marina Sanders and her younger brother, 11-year-old David Sanders. They lived in Anchorage with their mother, Linda Sanders, and stepfather, Greg Sanders, in a modest bungalow near Spenard. Linda worked evenings at a small hotel. Greg was a commercial fisherman, often away on multi-day trips. On the afternoon of Thursday, April 25, 1985, Marina and David had begged to take the family van for a short drive to the Johnson River Ridge, just outside Dry Creek, hoping to spring hunt the last of the frozen snowmelt pools before the opening of trout season. Linda had reluctantly agreed, giving them a key and warning them to be back by dusk. The ridge was a favorite scenic spot, a place where Greg sometimes fished from the bank, a place of remote beauty and isolation. Over the next 24 hours, the two young siblings did not return. Linda reported them missing after the van's return alone on the morning of April 26th. The van had been driven back into town by an unknown driver, then left in a public parking lot downtown. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside the van was a half-eaten sandwich, a pair of binoculars, their backpacks and the stuffed bear. Outside, no footprints in the slush, no struggle. It was as if the children had simply disappeared into thin air. The size of the investigation grew quickly. The Alaskan wilderness, the ridge, the river, the time of year, all combined to create tremendous obstacles. The remote terrain, the fading snow, the lack of witnesses in the dusk of Alaskan spring, it would all play into why the case went cold. Trooper Rivers and her partner, Sergeant Michael Soto, arrived at the ridge the following morning with a state search team and a volunteer dog unit from Anchorage. The registration number from the van led them immediately to the Sanders family. Linda and Greg were distraught. Linda recalled the children leaving at 3:15 p.m. with the van. Items in the van, snacks, 2 water bottles, a disposable camera matched what she had packed. Greg confirmed the vehicle's plate. At the ridge, investigators found the van exactly where the hunter had reported, partially off the road. The driver's side wheels embedded in softened earth, pointing toward the riverbank. Footprints were faint, but the spring thaw made them unreliable. Inside the van, the glove found by the hunter was dusted for prints and fibers, but by the time the crime lab in Anchorage reported back 2 weeks later, the glove had only partial prints, none matching the siblings, and no matches in the National Fingerprint Database. The backpack's name tag was traced to Marina Sanders, confirming the siblings had been in the van. Trooper Soto canvassed the area. He interviewed the hunter who found the van, a local trapper, and a pair of fishermen who had camped within a mile the night prior. The trapper reported he heard the van engine at about 7:45 p.m. on April 25th, but assumed it was his nephew returning. The fishermen said they noticed headlights around 8:10 p.m. but believed it was the van and didn't bother to investigate. None of the witnesses came forward earlier. The van's engine showed no signs of tampering. The ignition key turned normally. The engine ran but stalled within a minute. The driver's window was cracked. No blood or obvious sign of a fight. Within a week, the state issued an amber-style alert, though the formal amber system did not yet exist, calling for help and offering a reward. The media in Anchorage picked up the story. 2 children vanished on a remote ridge outside town, the family distraught. Volunteers combed bush and riverbanks. Sonar scans of the Johnson River were attempted, but visibility was low and the waters still swollen with spring melt. By mid-May, the weather warmed and the snowpack melted, making the ridge terrain tougher to track. Search dogs lost scent trails. The investigation shifted from an active search to a missing person, missing children file. With each passing week, leads dried up. Investigators focused first on the known associates of the siblings. Greg's fishing business had no credible enemies. Linda's job at the hotel had no reports of threats. Attention fell then to the van's unexpected driver. How had the vehicle returned without the children? Investigators discovered the van had been driven back into town by another driver. A witness had seen a blue pickup tow the family van into Anchorage on the night of April 25 or very early morning of April 26. The pickup left the van in a downtown lot and drove off. Unfortunately, the witness's description of the pickup was vague. Maybe a 1979-80 model, small camper shell, no license plate recorded. Around the same time, a local parolee, James Jimmy Hollis, age 27, emerged in investigators' radar. He was seen in the junction near Dry Creek on the evening of April 25th, driving his truck. He had passed DUI charges and was known to salvage abandoned vehicles. He admitted he had been on the ridge that night, says he scavenged some scrap metal. He denies seeing the van or the siblings. Investigators questioned him heavily and searched his truck and yard. They found no physical evidence linking him to the children or van. He was cleared as a potential culprit, though he remained a person of interest for months. Another red herring emerged when a dirty camping spot along the riverbank was found about 300 yards downstream from the ridge. Abandoned footprints, a small fire ring, 2 soda cans. Initially thought possibly linked, the investigators ran prints and fiber analysis. The footprints did not match the siblings, and the soda cans were traced to 2 fishermen who admitted leaving them. The camp turned out to be unrelated. In June 1985, a faint sighting, a young woman driving northbound on the George Parks Highway, reported seeing 2 children walking along the shoulder late afternoon, about 5:45 p.m. near the same ridge. The children were bundled in spring jackets, holding hands, and seemed disoriented. She reported the sighting the next day. Investigators could not locate the exact spot or run additional leads. It remained unverified and ultimately was categorized as unconfirmed. Over the summer, the weather improved, the river violence lessened, and the search scaled back. The siblings remained missing. Investigators still held out hope. The family held vigils, plastered posters in Anchorage and nearby towns. But as months passed, the trail grew colder. By 1986, the case was assigned to the Troopers' Cold Cases Unit. Trooper Rivers had long since moved on. Sergeant Soto retired, and a new investigator, Detective Laura Klein, took over the file. She faced the same obstacles: the vastness of the terrain, the limited physical evidence, The passage of time. Detective Klein reviewed all witness reports, re-interviewed the local residents, trapped for any memory of the night. She looked at meteorological records. The spring thaw on April 25th was unusually quick. Overnight, the snow melted from ridges, creeks were running high, the Johnson River was swollen. That meant any footprints or tracks could have been erased. Any items thrown into the river could have been carried far downstream. In 1987, Klein tried a fresh approach. She released a reconstruction sketch of Marina and David as they would look in 1985 and put an appeal for public tips. They received dozens of calls. Most turned out to be false alarms, adults remembering youth outings, similar-looking vans parked in remote spots, prank calls. One tip from a remote cabin owner claimed he heard children's voices near the ridge on April 25th, about 9 p.m. But when investigators traced the cabin occupant, he refused to cooperate. The case file reveals multiple frustrating moments. The van's engine log, its mileage had increased 12 miles from when it left Anchorage to when it was found. Investigators could not determine who drove those extra miles. The key was still in the ignition, and no fingerprints matched the children or any known adult. The glove found by the hunter had partial prints, but the lab declared too incomplete to match. The stuffed bear's tag, though traced to Marina's backpack, had melted ink and no forensic value. Winter came, and with it the Arctic darkness. The ridge and river became inaccessible again. For years, the investigation slid into a category of missing persons rather than active abduction. The family lobbied. The troopers kept the case alive, but resources were limited. Over the next decade, score of other cases drew attention. Higher priority cases, more evidence, more leads. The Sanders siblings case faded from headlines. It was in early 1998 that the unusual phone call came. A man in Anchorage, cleaning out a storage locker, found a rust-stained metal lunchbox marked Johnson Ridge Camp 1985. Inside was a Polaroid picture of a campfire group, but one face stood out, a young man smiling, holding a rifle, leaning against a log with two children beside him. The children looked very much like Marina and David, then younger. The photo's back was stamped G. Sanders, autumn 1985. Detectives reached out to Greg and Linda, who said the photo looked like their kids, but could not conclusively identify them. The storage locker holder claimed the box had been left by a man who rented the unit for 1 month in May 1985 and never returned. That man could not be traced. They had only a name, G. Sanders, which turned out to be Greg's name. A coincidence. Detective Klein reopened the case files, re-examined old evidence. The lunchbox itself had no fingerprints. The photograph was developed at a small photo lab in Anchorage that had closed years ago. However, the discovery renewed interest, and the troopers allocated some overtime funding for renewed ground search. In August 1998, a remote search team traveled to the Johnson River Bank Ridge area. Dry terrain and erosion made tracking difficult. Melt, growth, and moss covered old tracks. They did discover rusted rivets of a vehicle, possibly from the van, about a quarter-mile downstream from where the van was first located, but they could not conclusively link them to the 1981 Ford. The photographs taken of those rivets entered the file as possible van remains. By 2000, the case was still unsolved, but classified as active, low priority. The family filed a wrongful disappearance suit against the city for failure to act, but dropped it under confidential settlement. The troopers kept the siblings' names on their missing list, but no further credible leads emerged. In 2006, the troopers received a tip from a fisherman who claimed that in 1985, on the Johnson River bank near Dry Creek, he had seen a man digging shallow holes at night with a flashlight. He said he recognized the van parked nearby. It had its rear hatch open. The fisherman did not report it at the time because he assumed someone was ice fishing. But the tip triggered fresh interest. Detectives reviewed old logs and identified that the van had indeed been parked at the ridgeline the evening of April 25th, known from the hunter's sighting. They realized the time window when the van engine was running, according to the mileage log, corresponded roughly to the fisherman's sighting. They cross-referenced lists of vehicles in the area, those registered to Anchorage addresses with 1980-81 vans. One matched a rental van from a small Anchorage company, rented by a man named Richard Marlowe, age 33 in 1985, under a false name for 3 days, beginning April 24th. Marlowe had a criminal record for theft and had been in jail for a burglary in 1983. Released in late 1984. He'd vanished from local records in 1986, moved to Oregon under an alias. Detectives traced his movements. He was living under a new identity, had remarried, had children. They interviewed him in 2007, but he denied ever being in Alaska beyond a fishing trip in 1988. He had no memory of the rental van and insisted the rental company records were erroneous. Without physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprint match, no confession, detectives could not charge him. The statute of limitations for kidnapping did not apply. For murder there was none, but they needed probable cause. They kept him as a suspect, keeping tabs on the new identity. Meanwhile, the case file grew thicker. Witness statements, forensic notes, search logs, late-night tips, false sightings, rumors. In 2009, the troopers attempted to use emerging forensic technologies on the glove fibers, but the melting and moisture had degraded the fibers. No conclusive match. The backpack fabric was analyzed, but again no match to traceable sources. The photograph of the lunchbox remained tantalizing, but unusable as legal evidence. The case again slipped into dormancy. Several factors conspired to freeze the investigation: terrain and time of year. The ridge area is remote, forested, with melting snow and swelling river waters that likely erased tracks quickly. Investigators later concluded that by the time the van was discovered, hours had passed in near darkness, and any footprints or tire tracks had been washed or drifted over. Limited forensic evidence. The glove, the backpack, the van itself, all plausible pieces of evidence, but none yielded sufficient forensic connection. In 1985, DNA testing was nascent, and the glove's prints were partial. Over time, degradation further reduced utility. Witness scarcity. Only a handful of people reported seeing the van or the brother and sister. Many months later, interviews often conflicted. The hunter, the fisherman, the trapper had recollections but no clear timeline. Memory faded, resource allocation. For the troopers in Anchorage, remote missing children cases in wilderness areas demanded time and patrol allocation. But priorities shifted. Large-scale search operations are expensive in Alaska. Air support, sonar, dog teams cost money. With no new leads, the case fell into the cold file category, false leads and red herrings. Interviewing the salvage truck driver, the abandoned fire ring, the lunchbox photo, they consumed time and energy, but produced no break. Each redirected investigators, slightly delaying the real trail if there was one. Passage of time. The longer the siblings remained missing, the more the trail cooled. Memories faded. Evidence shifted through weather and terrain. Hope diminished. Investigators acknowledged that their best chance of a breakthrough would have been within weeks of disappearance. But by then, many hours had passed before serious action. Detective Klein in 2001 wrote in her internal report, "It is the remoteness and the silence of this place that makes the investigation so difficult. We are dealing with 2 children, a van, a remote ridge, and no body. That combination reduces the case from a vibrant search into a scenario of where did they go, rather than what happened to them." By 2010, the case file included over 3,000 pages of interviews, photographs, maps, search logs, forensic lab reports, and yet no culprit. The Sanders family held on, but the public interest had largely faded. It was July 2015, 30 years after the disappearance, when an amateur historian and remote terrain drone enthusiast, Matt Hollow, based in Anchorage, submitted to the troopers a high-resolution drone survey of the Johnson River bank ridge and adjoining woods. Hollow, scanning for historical vehicle wreckage, found an old metal frame partially beneath brush, about 700 feet downstream from the original van recovery site. He believed it to be the rusted chassis of a 1981 Ford van. He forwarded date and GPS-tagged photographs to the troopers. Trooper Rivers, now retired, returned to consult on the case. Investigators embarked on a ground recovery mission. In September 2015, forensic recovery crews excavated the site. What they found was extraordinary: a small rusted metal box embedded near tree roots. Inside, remarkably preserved despite the years, were 2 school bags, one emblazoned with the name Marina S, and a child's pink glove, the match to the one found in the van ridge, together with a small plastic figurine belonging to David. Soil samples from the bags were taken. Although degraded time and weather made DNA improbable, there were enough preserved fibers and a partial fingerprint ridge on the figurine's surface that matched Marina's known dental records via her dental wax imprint and sibling records. The discovery reignited the case. Investigators now believed that the children had left the van site, walked along the riverbank, and at some later point met with fatal misfortune. The abandoned bags indicated they may not have been abducted in a traditional way, but perhaps succumbed to the elements and collapsed in a small ravine, their remains long since carried away by water or scavengers. The lunchbox photo now gained new interest. The man holding the rifle was traced to Greg's fishing partner, who admitted to lending the van, unknown to Greg, for a short hunting outing the night of April 25th, and that the children had been in the back while he and the young man went hunting. He claimed he returned them to Anchorage later that night, but records show the van didn't reach the lot until the next morning. In 2017, the case took another twist. The fishing partner, Harold Hal Morrison, then aged 68, agreed to an interview under limited immunity. He admitted that on the night of April 25th, he had borrowed the Sanders van, with Greg's permission, for a short drive to the ridge. He claimed the children fell asleep in the back seat, that he got out to collect driftwood and left them inside the van for about 10 minutes, but when he returned, the van was gone. He said he panicked, searched for them but found nothing, and in his fear, he drove the van back to town and left it in the lot the next morning. He insisted he found no trace of the children and at the time did not call police because he'd thought perhaps they'd walked home or taken a ride. Investigators analyzed the statement but could not fully reconcile it with all evidence. Morrison could not account for the extra miles the van engine ran, the missing time between 7:45 p.m., hunter's sighting, and 8:10 p.m., fisherman's sighting. He also could not explain the lunchbox photo, which showed him with the rifle on the ridge after 9 p.m., contrary to his claimed timeline. Moreover, the discovery of the bags downstream suggested the children had left the van and walked into the woods rather than remained inside. Morrison became a strong suspect, but prosecutors concluded they lacked sufficient proof for indictment. Still, the case was no longer purely cold. The troopers refiled the investigation as active under review. The Sanders family got a modicum of closure. They now believed how the children disappeared, though not exactly why or who delivered the fatal blow. As of this writing, the case of Marina and David Sanders remains legally unsolved. No person has been charged, no definitive cause of death established, no body recovered. Yet it is far from forgotten. The 2015 discovery of the school bags and the downstream site changed the narrative. No longer purely vanished, but likely perished in the wilderness after leaving the van. In that sense, the case shifted from missing children to accidental foul play in wilderness environment. The investigators believe the most probable scenario is that the children left the van after a brief stop, walked along the riverbank, became lost or trapped in rising meltwater, collapsed in a ravine, and their remains were carried or scattered by river action or scavengers. Hal Morrison's involvement remains deeply suspicious. He admits borrowing the van. The timeline is inconsistent. He was the only adult known to drive the van that night besides the siblings, and his rifle appears in the lunchbox photo. But without physical evidence linking him definitively to the disappearance or death of the children, the case cannot be prosecuted. The Sanders family holds hope. Every year they visit the ridge. They place flowers near the Johnson River bank and carry pictures of Marina and David as they were. Marina with her long auburn hair and David with his shy smile. Linda Sanders now volunteers helping search and rescue teams in Alaska, hoping that if she can save even one child, it somehow redeems the years of waiting. For the state troopers, the vanishing at Dry Creek remains a reminder of the limits of wilderness investigations. Detective Klein wrote in 2018. We will never know exactly what happened along that ridge the night those children vanished. We can reconstruct the pieces. We can say they left the van, walked into the growing dusk of Alaskan spring, and were never seen again. But whether someone drove them off, or they succumbed to the elements, we cannot say with certainty. The case remains open. The evidence discovered years later provides strong leads, but no closure. The truth, as with so many great cold cases, remains just beyond reach. In the end, this narrative illustrates a truth: the vastness of Alaska, the isolated terrain, the frailty of forensic technologies in 1985, and the relentless passage of time all combined to create an investigation that slipped from hope into decades of waiting. The discovery of the school bags and the lunchbox photo brought new life to the case, but whether it will ever be solved in the legal sense remains unknown.